First-generation students often enter law school with an invisible backpack full of expectations, responsibilities, and questions that others don't always carry. Law professors are not looking for the right answer. They're looking for critical thinking. They're trying to assess whether you can understand the question. Law school isn't just intellectually rigorous, it's also emotionally and physically demanded. Many lawyers develop their addiction to coffee in law school.
Welcome and thank you for joining us for another Justia webinar. My name is Nina and I'll be the moderator for today. Now, to kick things off, I want to go ahead and introduce our speaker, Etienne Toussaint. Etienne C. Toussaint is a private law scholar whose work explores the historical development of poverty, food insecurity, and environmental injustice in the U.S. political economy. Drawing on critical legal theory, his scholarship examines the intersection of race, culture, and modern social movements in a challenging private law structure of the economy. He teaches contracts, business associations, law and political economy, and critical legal history at the University of South Carolina's Joseph F. Rice School of Law. For career advice in academia, you can visit thetenuretrack.com. The webinar presentation that you're about to watch will be approximately 1 hour. If you have any questions that arise during the presentation, we will answer those at the Q&A section at the end of the webinar, and you can submit those by clicking the Q&A button in the control panel at the bottom of your screen, and we will be sure to answer those at the end of the presentation. Without further ado, here's Etienne to discuss breaking barriers, building belonging, thriving in law school as a first-generation student.
Good afternoon and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining me for Breaking Barriers, Building Belonging, Thriving in Law School as a First-Generation Law Student. My name is Professor Etienne Toussaint, and I teach at the Joseph F. Rice School of Law at the University of South Carolina, and it is my privilege to share this space with you today. So today we are going to talk about what it takes to thrive in law school as a first-generation student. I'm going to begin with an introduction and then walk through a few different topics that I think are important to help you navigate this experience. We'll talk about understanding the first-gen experience. We'll go over some tools for academic success. We'll talk about building a supportive network, owning your own story and voice, and how to thrive beyond the classroom. At the end, we'll have an opportunity for questions and answers. You'll be able to provide questions in the chat function, and our moderator, Nina McKee, will help to coordinate that session. By providing a little bit about my story. I grew up in the South Bronx in New York City. I am the proud son of immigrants from the island of Dominica in the West Indies. My father, who moved here as a young adult, eventually became a city bus driver after a time period in the United States Army. And my mother, who was an only child and moved here as an infant, eventually became a nurse, both in New York City. We did not have any lawyers in our immediate family, and I was the first in my immediate family to step into the legal profession as a lawyer. I pursued a graduate degree at Harvard, a law degree. Prior to that, I studied engineering at MIT and Johns Hopkins. I also pursued a master's in law at the George Washington Law School. But here's what those credentials don't show. Law school was hard. I struggled with imposter syndrome. I struggled with not understanding the details of the hidden curriculum, which we'll get into a little bit. And I struggled with how to navigate the stresses of law school, balancing jobs outside of the building, thinking about loans, and thinking about other pressures, both financial and emotional, that impacted my ability to navigate space within the classroom and outside. Eventually, I found myself in the beginning asking, do I even belong here? If any of that sounds familiar to you, if you've ever felt unsure, unseen, or unprepared, I think you're in the right place today. As an associate professor of law, my mission is to empower students like you to overcome those barriers, not just to survive in law school, but to thrive. And so as we go through this presentation, we're going to talk about strategy, community, identity, and purpose, because you absolutely belong in law school. And I'm happy today to help walk you into the beginning stages of that journey. So let's begin first by naming a truth. First-generation students often enter law school with an invisible backpack full of expectations, responsibilities, and questions that others don't always carry. One of the heaviest, as I mentioned before, is imposter syndrome. That is that inner voice that says, everyone else belongs here and I don't. I can certainly remember sitting in my 1L classes, hearing some of my other classmates speak with ease about the legal language that we were learning in our casebooks, and wondering if I was the only one struggling, if I was the only one searching for the dictionary to figure out what these cases were talking about. Secondly, as I mentioned, it seemed like there was a hidden curriculum, unspoken rules about what to do outside of the classroom to succeed. Things like outlining, networking, and how to take advantage of office hours. There are a few books that have been written recently to try to navigate and expose some of these unwritten rules. One is a text written by a former colleague, Andrew Ferguson, who's at the American University School of Law. He'll be moving to George Washington School of Law in the upcoming academic year. And his book is about how to navigate the first year of law school. But there are a few resources like that help you to understand, how do you approach the classroom? How do you prepare for law school and navigate the unspoken rules of success? And finally, as I mentioned, there are financial and emotional pressures that add additional stress onto the academic experience. Let me take you back to my first semester at Harvard Law School. I recall one of my classmates asking if I had finished my outline. I smiled, I nodded. In my prior academic experiences in engineering, I knew what it meant to outline, but I really didn't know what that meant in the law school context. So I quickly went to Google afterwards to try to figure out what exactly was a law school outline. And I didn't want to admit at the time that I really had no idea. But that moment captures a lot about what it means to be a first-generation student. I came from a very tight-knit community in the South Bronx. We had to work hard, we had to hustle, and we had a lot of heart. But I didn't grow up hearing about law school, hearing about lawyering, and hearing about how to navigate a legal career. So I was navigating this law school environment blind, so to speak. Of course, academically, I felt strong, but culturally, socially, and structurally, I felt a bit lost. I also worked part-time during my second and third year of law school to help afford my expenses. And I even felt pressured during law school to eventually go into corporate law to justify the immense debt that I was taking on, even though I knew my calling was in public interest. So I know what it's like to balance these competing pressures and try to figure out how to make a career in law when there are multiple things pressing on either side. The tension between purpose and pressure was pretty constant. It took me some time to realize I didn't need to fit into someone else's mold, and I could define success my own way. And I want to affirm to you today, you don't have to choose between your background and your future. In fact, your personal story can be the pathway toward your success as long as you allow it to be your strength. Let's talk a little bit about some tools for academic success. So let's get practical. Law school is demanding, but it's not impossible, especially when you find tools that work for you. One of the first keys that I learned early on is experimenting with how you study so you figure out what kinds of learning methods work for you. Personally, I tried everything. For one class during my first semester of law school, I made handwritten notes and sat in the front row to stay focused. For another class, I typed directly into a digital outline that I had acquired from one of the student support groups. And for another class, I tried to create my own custom outline from scratch. My approach during that first semester was to try to figure out how I learned by trial and error, and I eventually did figure out what worked best for me. Next, I think it's important to understand the purpose of outlining in law school. As I said, I really didn't understand how to outline and what made it different from outlining during my prior degrees in engineering. So one of the things that I think is incredibly important is to distinguish between creating an outline for class and creating an outline for your law school exams. In most law schools, you often will take at most 2 exams, one exam during the middle of the semester and a final exam at the end of the semester. And in some instances, you still will be assessed based on just one exam at the end of the semester, which is the old school law school assessment model. But it is important to distinguish how to prepare for that exam. Some students operate under the mistaken belief that if they take notes during every single class, they can utilize that outline, which can get very lengthy, to prepare for their final exam. But it's very difficult to take what might become an 100 to 150 page outline over the course of 3 months to prepare for a final exam because they serve different purposes. Your classroom outline rather, is really designed to help you engage in classroom conversation, engage in that Socratic dialogue that is so traditional to the doctrinal classroom during that first year. And by Socratic dialogue, I mean a law professor trying to teach students through the practice of asking questions. So Socratic questioning is a style of teaching where your law professor will ask questions to different students to try to tease out the insights from the reading material. And your outline might be summarizing the material that you've read and writing down some key insights so that when a professor calls on you, you're prepared to answer the question. And an outline for an exam focuses on the kinds of questions that are assessed on the exam itself. And generally on an exam, you're provided with a factual scenario or a fact pattern and a question about the law related to that fact pattern. And in most instances, law school professors will expect you to answer using a structure called IRAC, I-R-A-C, which you'll see on the graphic on the right. They want you to identify the legal issue. They want you to state the relevant law that applies to this particular issue. They want you to discuss the facts in the fact pattern and apply those facts to the rule that you've identified. And they want you to ultimately provide a conclusion on how you would resolve the legal issue based on this factual analysis in conjunction with the rule. In your class discussions, you're going to do a similar process, but that process occurs through the conversational process. Now, finally, I'll note, don't make the mistake of waiting until November to start studying for your exams, which typically are at the end of November or sometimes in the beginning of December. You really want to start exam preparation in the middle of the semester. And of course, if you have a midterm, you'll start studying for the midterm prior to that time. And studying for law exams is not just reviewing your outline and learning the rules and gaining familiarity with the insights that are taught in the classroom. It's actually practicing with timed practice questions that simulate the exam environment. So you want to time yourself and then review model answers. It's not about perfection. It's about preparation and getting comfortable answering these style questions under timed conditions. Now let's talk about the dreaded cold call. This is the moment, as I mentioned, when your name is called, your heart skips a beat, and all of your classmates are staring directly at you. Of course, different law professors will approach the law school classroom in different ways. There are different pedagogical approaches to teaching, but the Socratic approach is the traditional approach. And it's very common, especially in your first year of law school, that you will experience this style of teaching. This can be very scary, but I'm here to tell you that you don't have to be afraid as long as you remember you do not have to be perfect. And this is what helped me to shift my mindset about cold calling. Law professors are not looking for the right answer. They're looking for critical thinking. They're trying to assess whether you can understand the question and connect insights and facts that you glean from your reading and connect it to the question to push the conversation forward. Because their goal is to teach the material by asking a series of questions from a variety of students to pull out the key insights. So as long as you can provide some insight or some information that helps to push the conversation along, you will have achieved the goal of responding to the cold call. Of course, you have to be prepared once you step into the classroom. So let's talk about time management really quickly. One of the things that I did that was really helpful was to treat law school like a 40-hour work week. That meant arriving at law school at the same time every morning and leaving at the same time at the end of the afternoon. And when I mean leave, I mean leaving my work. That meant even if I did not have class, I was going to the library or a study room and using that time to study and work on preparing for class. That really helped me to balance academics with extracurricular activities that I could then participate in after hours or on the weekend. And so once I left my job at the end of my workday, it gave me the freedom and permission to rest or to participate in extracurricular activities. And that's really important to give yourself balance. Law school is professional school. So you don't want to spend all of your time on academics. You also want to make sure you allow time for networking, for participating in student organizations, for participating in clinic work, and for making relationships that will be incredibly important for the future of your career. Let's talk about building a supportive network. One of the most transformative parts of my law school experience was building community. It really changed everything. For me, the Black Law Students Association was one of the organizations that really became an anchor. It was a place where I didn't have to explain my background, where I could ask real questions without fear, and where I saw students who were 1 or 2 years ahead of me that were thriving. And so I could see myself in them, ask them questions, and gain insights from their challenges and their successes. I eventually joined the leadership board of the National Black Law Students Association, which helped me to grow professionally. It helped me to develop leadership skills and build a network of like-minded individuals, both in my school and beyond. Outside of affinity groups, I also leaned into law school events, career panels, guest speaker sessions during the lunch, and other lunch talks that gave me information that I did not get inside of the classroom. I went, I listened, I introduced myself, and over time, those small moments turned into real relationships. Finally, I tell my students now, take advantage of office hours, not just once, but multiple times throughout the semester. My recommendation is for each class, you should try to visit office hours at least 3 times during the semester. Once in the beginning to simply introduce yourself to the professor, once in the middle of the semester to ask a couple questions about foundational concepts that you're trying to nail down, and once near the end of the semester to check in about the material, to maybe ask some more detailed questions that have emerged during your studying, and to make sure that you feel confident about the material as you're heading into finals. Of course, you're not bothering your professors. You're building a bridge and you're creating relationships that can sometimes evolve into mentoring relationships, which is very important. Law school, of course, can be an isolating environment for many people, especially when you're first generation and you're trying to navigate law school without a roadmap and sometimes without familiar faces in the classroom or in the field. But I want to offer you something that changed my experience, and that is connection. So first, let's start with your professors. I know it can feel intimidating to approach faculty, especially if you're worried about being unprepared or unknowledgeable. But I discovered that office hours are not only for asking questions about the law, they're opportunities to build relationships. Professors remember the students who show up, who share their story, and who demonstrate a commitment to learning. So start simple. Go to office hours during the beginning of the semester, introduce yourself, share where you're from, why you came to law school, and even share something that you're curious about or a question you have. That initial step can reduce anxiety, and it can make a huge impact on the kind of experience you have in the classroom for the remainder of the semester. In addition, pursuing leadership opportunities can help you build relationships with peers and develop other mentorship relationships. Beyond formal roles, it's important to find your people. Look for peers who share your background, who share your energy, who share your questions. Those friendships will become essential as you navigate the emotional ups and downs of law school. I was able to find community, as I said, in Balsa. There are lots of other organizations, from the Law Review to intramurals, that can help you overcome isolation and find community. Remember, isolation is not a sign that you don't belong. It is a signal for you to seek out connection. Let's talk about owning your story and your voice. So I want to tell you a truth. Your background, your individual journey is not something that you have to hide or overcome to be successful in law school. It's something that you have to learn to own and build upon and fuel the work that you do. As a first generation student, it's common for people to think that your story, your challenges, your unique lived experience is something to keep quiet. You believe that if you can fit into law school, you need to sound like everyone else. You need to think like everyone else. You need to dress like everyone else. But what I realize is that sometimes the opposite is true. My identity growing up in the Bronx, my identity as the son of immigrants, my interest in social justice and racial justice based on how I grew up and the issues that I observed during my childhood, during my adolescence, all of that made me a better student. It allowed me to ask better questions in class. It allowed me to discern insights that shaped how I approached my clinical experiences, how I approached my research, and it gave me a lens that was often missing from many of the spaces that I entered. When I enrolled in courses about environmental justice or poverty law, I didn't just engage from a theoretical angle. I brought real stories, real experiences, and a real passion for public service that benefited my peers that didn't have that same experience. That not only enriched the classroom discussion, but it helped me see the law's impact beyond the pages of the casebook, and everyone in the classroom was better for it. So please remember, your story can open up doors of learning that others don't even see. Don't be silent. Speak up in class, especially when a case intersects with your lived experience. You can share your job about a professional experience. You can share your experiences living in certain communities. You can share your experiences during networking sessions outside of the classroom. All of this creates an authentic connection with others around you. And remember, when you show up fully and authentically, you give others permission to do the same. And that is leadership in action. Let's talk a bit about thriving beyond the classroom. So we talked about how to succeed in the classroom, about Socratic questioning, about outlining, about owning your own story. But what about outside of the classroom? So let's be honest, law school isn't just intellectually rigorous, it's also emotionally and physically demanded. Many lawyers develop their addiction to coffee in law school. The students that thrive long term are the ones that learn how to balance the demands that are in the classroom with the demands outside of the classroom, especially students that have families, jobs, and other obligations that are pulling on their time. For me, that meant balancing a rhythm of life that supported my mental health and my physical health and kept me connected to what really mattered. I worked out regularly at the campus gym, not only because I wanted to feel healthy, but I also wanted to manage the stress of the classroom environment that was so demanding. And some of my best friendships were developed on the basketball court after classes had already finished. Social events were another way to stay grounded. It was a way to build relationships rather than isolating myself in the library. And some of the greatest lessons that I learned during law school came over late night meals with friends, came while venting about cold calls during a basketball game, or came simply while discussing a legal issue while hanging out at a social event. So the community events can actually help you regulate your stress, regulate your nervous system, and manage the competing demands on your mental, emotional, and physical systems. So I want to transition now into a Q&A. I'm happy to go a little bit deeper into many of the topics that I discussed before. And before I go into the Q&A, I want to just answer some of the questions that you might be thinking, like imposter syndrome, networking, and then I'll open it up for other questions that you might have in the chat. One of the things I want to mention first is that the pressures of law school are real. As I mentioned, I went into law school thinking I wanted to go into public interest law. And for personal, professional reasons, I found myself pulled into corporate law working at a law firm. It was an opportunity, to be quite honest, to make money that I had never seen before, that no one in my family had ever seen before. And the opportunity to help others in my family, in my community financially was a real pressure. And that's okay. It is okay to experiment, to explore different pathways. I discovered once I went to a law firm that I was learning a lot, but it ultimately wasn't for me. And after staying for 2 years, I transitioned into a public interest organization. So it is okay to experiment, to explore different pathways, to change your mind along the way. You don't have to have it all figured out on day one. Secondly, before we go into the Q&A, I want to reiterate the importance of prioritizing wellness. That means not just going to class and studying, but participating in spiritual practices, participating in health and wellness activities. Those are really, really important to making sure that you can navigate law school in a healthy way. So in conclusion, we've covered a lot of ground today, from understanding the first generation experience, building academic success, community, and purpose. And so at this point, I want to open it up and hear from you and really delve deeper into what some of your questions are. questions perhaps about cold calling, about managing stress, about finding the right career, making friends. I'm happy to go deeper into all of those things. And so I want to end as I began with a story. During my first few weeks at Harvard Law School, I felt overwhelmed by the sense that everyone else had it figured out and I did not know what I was doing. I remember being invited to go to a study group. I sat down at the table and I felt lost. And I got up 15 minutes later and left and never went back to the study group and had to explore different ways of studying with people, but not necessarily in a traditional study group. I recall being afraid to ask questions in class in the beginning, afraid to go to office hours because I didn't want to admit that there were a lot of terms and a lot of concepts that I simply did not understand. And I thought going and asking those questions would just confirm my fear that I didn't belong. But I eventually decided to visit a professor's office, and I asked a question that felt obvious and silly, and in my mind, stupid. And the professor looked at me, he smiled, and he said, "That's a great question. No one ever asked that, but everyone wonders it." And that's the moment that flipped the switch. It gave me the confidence to ask questions with clarity and to realize that everyone in law school, from your faculty to the administration, wants you to succeed. And our job is to empower you along the way to do that. So with that, I want to invite you to bring some of that courage now. Submit your questions in the chat. You can do so anonymously, but I think that turning this into a conversation and not a test is going to provide a platform for you to learn the most from this experience. Remember, this isn't about having all the answers. It's about growing together and learning together in this moment, right here, right now. So thank you for your time. I'm going to stop sharing the screen so you can see my face, and then we can shift into a conversation together.
Thank you, Etienne. We do have a few questions already, so we can definitely dive right in. But if you have a question and you're wondering where to submit it, you can go ahead and click on that Q&A button in the control panel at the bottom of your screen and submit them there. There is the option to submit anonymously or with your name. We already have some questions, as I mentioned, so I'll go ahead and dive right in. Our first question is from Robin. They ask, how do you balance law school while working full-time? Do you have any advice or experience with that?
It's an excellent question, and I can speak a little bit both firsthand and from observing as a professor. So in my law school and in many law schools, you're a quote unquote forbidden from working during your first year. Now, certainly there are students that still do so because they have to, but you're encouraged strongly to not work during the first year. And I did not work during my first year, but I did work part-time during the second and third on the weekends. But when I taught as a professor at my prior institution, we had a part-time program. And so there were students who worked full-time during their entire law school career and were taking classes at night or sometimes during the day in between their work. And so I've seen it both ways. And what I've learned is the way to be successful and do that is to be very organized and use your time strategically. As I said, treat law school like a full-time job. And that means building a schedule in advance for how you're going to utilize your time. I would show up at law school every day at 8:30 or 8 a.m. or 8:30 and get started. If my first class was at 10, that meant from 8:30 to 10, I was doing some kind of study or preparation. If I only had one class that day, after that class, I was going to the library and taking advantage of studying or working on preparing for the next day's classes. And so you'll find that putting in that much time means you're going to be very far ahead from your other classmates, because students that don't have that discipline, when they see their law school schedule, will see those blocks of time as opportunities to go to the gym or take a break or go hang out in the library and talk. And those are fine things to do. But I found that what works best is to schedule out in advance when you're going to do extracurricular activities, when you're going to do wellness activities, when you're going to do personal wellness activities. And I push those to after hours. I'm going to do health and wellness in the evenings. I'm going to go to extracurriculars in the evenings. I'm going to hang out with friends on the weekends or in the evenings. But during the daytime, I'm at work. I'm doing law school, so I can maximize that time.
Awesome. Thank you for that insight. We do have a couple questions about outlining. So, Robin asks, do you have any examples or tools that you can share about how to outline, what personally worked best for you? And then Luis kind of added on to that. They say, what are the different types of outlines that you used, and how would you differentiate when and how to use them?
Sure. Great question. There are a lot of different ways that you can pursue outlining. Some say, and I'll walk through a few. So obviously, when you start law school, you will learn that there are commercial outlines that exist for many of your classes. And what does that mean? There are businesses that help students to prepare for the bar exam, like Barbary or Themis or other companies. And these companies actually create outlines for many of the law school classrooms. And these outlines come in book form. They summarize the law. Sometimes they even summarize the key cases. They tease out the issues. They tease out the law. And you might look at that and think, wow, I don't have to do any work. They've already provided the outline for me, and I can just take this book and study it. I think that's a wrong approach, to rely solely on the commercial outline. But one approach is to take an existing commercial outline and build upon it by typing in additional information that you're learning from your reading materials and from the classroom. That's one approach. A second approach that you will learn is that students get outlines from other students who took the class in the prior year or years. So you're starting and you'll meet second and third year students who have already taken your professor in the past. And so they have already compiled their own outline and they'll hand it over to you. And again, one of the risks is to take that outline and say, this is great. I don't have to do anything. I can just read this, study this outline, attend class. I already have the answers in front of me and I'm good. That is also a danger because you may not fully internalize and understand all of the information. Some of that content may have been typed in that person's language and the way that they understand it. And so you don't fully grasp the material. But one approach is to take that outline and tweak it so that it's in your language, your understanding, rewrite the information, add additional information. The third approach is to write an outline from scratch. That's the hardest approach. It takes the most amount of time, but it could be the best approach for some people because it means that you really understand the material at its core. There's no right or wrong approach, so I'm not going to recommend any one other than saying don't rely on someone else's outline without doing some of your own work to build upon it. That said, what I am going to recommend with outlining is you create 2 sets of outlines. And this is something that a lot of professors or administrators do not tell you. The outline that you create and build from class, which sometimes can grow to as long as 150 pages, should not be your primary outline that you use to prepare for the exam. And this is my personal philosophy. I think you should create a second outline that distills that information down to its core components. And that is, what are the core issues that you've learned? What are the core rules connected to those issues? And what are the core frameworks that you need to utilize to attach those rules to different factual scenarios? And that outline can be as short as 10 pages. It might be 15 pages, but that outline comes out of practice questions. It comes out of doing practice questions and seeing like, okay, I've looked at a practice question. What is the issue that I'm being asked? What are the rules connected to that issue? What is the process that I go through to answer that question? Do I understand it? How do I distill that down into an outline? So that is an outline that you build as you begin studying for the exam. And it means that you may be just stripping out a lot of the notes from class, stripping out a lot of the discussion of the case's facts, the policy debates and other things, and really getting down to the nitty gritty. Finally, what you'll find is that in your law school exams, you're going to be asked to answer questions using a format called IRAC, IRAC. You're going to be asked to write an essay where you identify the legal issue that is at the heart of the question, then identify the legal rule that you need to use to answer or resolve that issue. You need to apply the different elements of that rule to the facts in the question, almost like a mathematical formula, and then provide a conclusion that answers the question that's at the heart of the fact pattern. And so one approach to outlining is to think about how what you're learning in the cases applies to that structure. As you're reading the case material, you want to be thinking, what is the issue? Or what issues is this case teaching me? What rules am I learning from this case? How is the judge applying these rules to the facts that they're analyzing? And what is the ultimate conclusion or holding of the case? It's going to be a little bit difficult at first, but as you practice it, you'll start to see the connections between what's happening in classroom conversation and what you're expected to actually do on the exam.
Thank you so much for those insights on outlining. Our next person asks anonymously, how do I find a mentor who genuinely understands the first generation experience in law school? What would you recommend?
That's a really great question. And it's hard because there's fear in quote unquote outing yourself. You know, you may have worked really hard to go through college and graduate school and even start your career, and you've overcome tremendous odds. And there's fear in sort of raising your hand and saying, I don't know what I'm doing. Yes, I have degrees from great schools, but here I am, and I just don't get it. No one in my family is a lawyer. You know, the fear is that people are going to think that you're not good enough, that you're unqualified. And that fear is doubly felt by people from minoritized communities because of the imposter syndrome, because of the fear that someone will say, you're just here because of affirmative action. And this proves it. You don't even know what we're talking about. You don't even know what a holding is. You don't know what a rule is. You don't know what stare decisis means. You don't know what precedent means. You don't know what any of these terms mean. And that just shows that you don't belong here. So there's so much fear, and I get it, and I understand that. And it's important to just honor that and understand that that is the barrier and the hurdle that's confronting you. And a lot of people feel that and they don't voice it. I felt that, right? And I was at Harvard Law School. And I felt that I couldn't say it because, well, I had gone to MIT for college, right? So people looking at me like, this guy is smart. If I raise my hand and say, what is a precedent? Like, I don't understand what this circuit and, you know, circuit court system is. I never really understood that in a deep level. You know, someone's going to say, how did you even get here? You must be an affirmative action kid or something. So I think it's important to try to identify supportive groups where you can find like-minded students that maybe have shared your experience. As I said, for me, the Black Law Students Association was a helpful space to seek that out. Sometimes it's seeking out faculty members who might, you know, you can identify a connection there. Some law schools have a first-gen law student organization that you can join and that provide that support. So certainly look for that support. I would say if you can't find it, reach out to administrators, the Dean of Student Affairs. They exist to help you find this information. And they're a friendly face where you can send them an email and say, I feel uncomfortable. Can you point me to some students who are 2Ls and 3Ls, or can you point me to some organizations that I can get the support I need? And they will be very happy to do so and hold your confidence, right? They're not going to out you. They're not going to shame you. They're there to support you. So reach out to your Dean of Students if you can't find it. But if not, if you can, try to find some 2Ls or 3Ls or faculty members that you can approach and just say, hey, I'm new to this. I'm trying to learn the nuts and bolts. No one in my family really went to law school. Can you help me figure out some of these things that I don't know?
Awesome. There is a question that really strongly relates to that. It's from another anonymous attendee. They mentioned that they're an online school and they don't really have classmates close by or institutional associations they feel connected to. Do you have any tips or advice about building those relationships, kind of building off of what you just mentioned?
Hear correctly, the question is about how do you build relationships when you're in an online school and so you don't have that face-to-face interaction. So great question. And I don't know the nuts and bolts of what the school dynamic is, if it's all online. To the extent that you still have an opportunity to participate in affinity groups or student groups, try to do so. And that's a way to connect. Um, but here's something that I'll say that connects to the broader question of networking and building relationships. So building relationships is very important in law school. Law school is professional school, which means it's not enough to just succeed academically and have a great legal career. And in fact, some people aren't the top of their law school class, but because they've mastered the professionalism side, the networking side, their career goes much further than students that did better than them in the classroom, ironically, right? So you have to make sure you invest time not just in building relationships, but also in building not just building your academic skills, but also in building relationships with students and with faculty. Um, the relationship that students often miss is building relationships with lawyers. And that's hard. And you might think, well, how do I do that? But you should think about how can I start building relationships with lawyers from my first year? One way is to attend events like lunchtime sessions and just meet people and try to connect and get their business card or connect with them on LinkedIn, right? Try to meet people and be intentional about fostering that relationship. So if you meet someone at a career event during your 1L year, get their contact information, follow up with them in 6 months and say, hey, I met you a few months ago. I just wanted to touch base and let you know how law school is doing, right? And let you know how I'm learning and the things that I'm enjoying. Touch base with them 6 months later. Hey, just want to touch base. Now I'm in my second year. Things are going great. I'm learning so much. I really appreciate you always taking the time to connect with me. Reach out to them again 6 months later. Hi, I'm in my third year. I just wanted to let you know how things are going. I've really enjoyed over the past few years having the opportunity to connect with you and share with you. Now you have a relationship with someone. And so as you're getting to the state of looking for jobs, it's much easier to reach out to that person and say, I've really appreciated your mentorship over the past couple years, right? And they're thinking, wow, I have been their mentor. Like I've been reaching out to them. And you can say, I'm looking for job opportunities. Can you keep me in mind or can you share with me anything that you hear about? Or they might just do it themselves because you're on their mind. It's actually surprising how few students do that, right? And so lawyers will remember the one or two students that constantly are reaching out to them. You will stand out. The other thing that you can and should do is take advantage of your alumni network from your college. And you can use LinkedIn for that. And this is really great if you don't have any lawyers in your immediate circle. Go to LinkedIn, find and use the search function to filter and search for lawyers or people with a law degree from your college. You don't have to actually know them, but once you find them, then you start cold calling people, right? Via email. And you can send, and this is like a cheat code, right? You can send a form email to all of these people that says, hi, I discovered on LinkedIn that we both graduated from the same college. I'm currently in law school and you're working as a practicing attorney. And I'd love to chat with you for 20 minutes just to learn more about what you do. And now with Zoom, you could chat with them on Zoom, or you could chat with them on the phone. And if you're in the same city, you could even meet with them for coffee, maybe. If you find a couple people intentionally, right, and if you know what areas of law you're interested in, you could even filter it more and reach out to people who are practicing in the areas that you're interested in. If you want to be a public defender, you can search for public defenders who graduated from your college, who maybe live in the city that you're interested in living in, and reach out and say, hey, I noticed that you're a public defender and you graduated from the university that I went to. I'd love to talk to you about your career. Those people will respond because they're like, oh, you're a fellow alumni. This is fantastic. I'd love to talk to you about what I'm doing. And that's a way to build relationships with people that you don't know, by finding the thing that will connect you, which sometimes your college, or maybe your graduate school, or maybe a former job, right? If you were paralegal or something like that. So try to find any connections that you can use to build relationships. You have to be very proactive. And let me just share one final thing. All right, this is important. You cannot rely upon just doing the bare minimum, which is doing what like your career office says that you should do. You really have to take advantage of every opportunity. When I was in law school, over the winter break between the fall semester of my first year and the spring semester, I sent out an email with a resume and a cover letter to 50 law firms in the city that I was interested in working in. Yes, we had a career fair on campus and I spoke to those people, but I reached out individually to 50 law firms. 2 of those law firms responded to me and said, hey, we're really interested in inviting you for an interview. 2 out of 50, right? And 1 of them gave me a job. And that's where I worked the summer after my first year. And that law firm wasn't at the career fair, right? So it's like me, you have to be proactive and seek out these opportunities.
Thank you. Our next question is related to that hidden curriculum that you mentioned. Can you expand on kind of what you would define that as, and maybe ways to navigate or prepare for that going into law school?
So the hidden curriculum has to do with understanding what are the things that will allow you to be successful in law school that are not apparent in the curriculum itself or on the surface, right? And what are the things that will allow you to be successful as a lawyer? For example, joining law review is a great way to boost your resume, and it's a great way to make you stand out for job opportunities. A lot of students don't know about that. And joining law review, there are a variety of ways you can join law review. One is based on your grades. Another is based on participating in a competition where you're writing an essay and you're evaluating some issues and kind of doing an exam style analysis. But some students don't realize how valuable joining law review can be for their careers as part of the hidden curriculum. Also, pursuing a clerkship after law school can be a great way to be a bridge into great career opportunities. But to get a clerkship, you have to get recommendations from professors. And the only way to get great recommendations from professors is to have a relationship with a professor. If you start thinking about recommendations in your spring semester of your 3L year, you may not have intentionally developed good relationships with professors. That's why going to office hours is important. It's not just about answering questions in class. It's about building relationships that could turn into recommendations for a fellowship or clerkship, which means you may want to strategically pick some of your classes for the sole purpose of building relationships with professors. Oh, this professor I had during my first year, let me take another class with him or her during my second year. So that way, during my 3L year, I could potentially reach out to them and say, would you write a recommendation? And they're able to say, wow, I taught them in 2 classes or 3 classes. There's so much I could write about. They came to my office hours on multiple occasions, not just to talk about the class material, but to talk about their career passions, to talk about their interests. But that takes intentional work over time. And if you wait too late, you're not going to have anyone who can write a great recommendation, and that can unlock opportunities. We talked about outlining, right? And that's part of the hidden curriculum. You might think if I show up in class and I answer every question right, I will get an A. There are some students who show up in class and say nothing. Because in some classes, class participation is worth 10% of your grade, and the exam is worth 90% of your grade. But you're so focused on class participation because of cold calling, and you spend all your time preparing for class. Remember I said there's 2 outlines. You spend all your time building that class outline. So if I'm cold called, I know what to say. And then you're 2 weeks away from the final exam, and you say, oh man, I haven't practiced any exams. I don't know how to answer these exam questions. And my class participation is only worth 10% of my grade. And you've mastered answering questions in class. And there are other students that barely spoke up in class, but during the whole semester, they've been doing practice exam questions while you were hanging out in the library, preparing for class. And so you go to the exam and you're struggling and you end up with a C in the class. And you're like, how did I get a C in the class? I had a great outline. I was always speaking up in class. I understood these cases, but I just couldn't figure out the exam. And my colleague who never spoke up in class, who never said anything insightful, got an A. That's part of the hidden curriculum. You have to know what's going to allow you to succeed. That doesn't mean don't participate in class, right? You're paying a lot of money. You want to participate in the class discussion. It's going to help you learn, but understand that class preparation and class success doesn't mean exam preparation and exam success. And the earlier you know that, the earlier you can begin to prepare for the exam, separate and apart from preparing for class, right? That's another part of the hidden curriculum. And the final hidden curriculum is the curriculum that occurs in office hours. Some students never go to office hours because they think, oh, I got it. I understand it. I don't have to go to office hours. There is learning that occurs during office hours that doesn't occur in the classroom, even if you've mastered the material. Because it's impossible for a faculty member, and I'm just speaking for myself, not to unconsciously emphasize certain things in conversation during office hours that are part of what they care the most about you learning. That will just come out of conversation. You'll go to office hours and be like, I'm really enjoying the class. I just want to confirm my understanding of a few key issues, A, B, C, and they'll be like, excellent, you got it down. The first thing is probably not that important for you to know. And you'll be like, oh, mental note. Now I know I don't need to emphasize that for my studying. I can really focus on other things. But they didn't say that in class. So there's some additional learning that happened in the office hours, right? Or you bring a practice question to office hours and say, I worked on this practice question. I think I got it down. This is how I approached it. Can I take 10 minutes and walk it through? And they're able to say, that's a really great approach, but you might want to do this and this. And that gives you additional insights that you don't get in the class. And that is key learning. That's part of the secret curriculum, because now you're walking into the exam with a couple extra class sessions that other students did not take advantage of.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that insight. This next question is more so about moving into potentially legal academia. I did want to mention before I allow you to share your resources that Etienne will actually be back with us at the end of July for another presentation specifically about moving into legal academia, if that's something that you're interested in. So please be sure to keep an eye out for that. It will be on July 30th, but we will be sending out announcements. So be sure to keep an eye out for that. Other than that, this person does say that they are currently teaching real estate licensing classes and they're drawn to becoming a law professor. They ask, how do I go about moving towards that track? Are there any resources or recommendations that you have?
So as Ms. McKee mentioned, there's going to be an additional session where we're able to go into much more detail about legal academia. So I won't spend too much time on it. What I will say is, for people that are going into law school, that are thinking about academia, it's definitely great to be mindful then of what activities you participate in law school. You certainly want to try to get on a law journal or law review. You want to take advantage of independent research opportunities, writing a note or writing a research paper, because that is the kind of work that you'll do in legal academia. And certainly for those that are already practicing attorneys and lawyers, having some legal scholarship either written or in the process of being written is very, very important. That's sort of the key to the realm in terms of getting into academia. You're going to be asked about your legal scholarship, your scholarly agenda. What have you written? What are you working on? What are you thinking about writing in terms of legal scholarship? So that's very, very important. And taking advantage of teaching fellowships is a great opportunity to break into law teaching. And that's something I can share more about. But teaching fellowships are a bridge between practice and teaching. It's a space where you can step into the teaching environment, and you might be teaching legal research and writing. There are some fellowships that focus on teaching in the clinical fields. And that gives you an opportunity to start teaching and a platform to start working on your scholarship at the same time. And some are 1 year, some are 2 years, but it gives you a launching pad to then go into the hiring job market for legal academic jobs, which I'll provide much, much more detail on in that next webinar.
Wonderful. Thank you. Our next question is really about time management. You've touched on this a bit, kind of balancing out, blocking your time of what's going to be personal wellness, what's going to be, dedicated to your studies. But do you have any tips specifically about where to start with that blocking, or what you would recommend? This person notes that they feel like there's not enough time in the day at all during law school. So what would you recommend?
Yeah. So the first thing to recognize and honor and affirm, even in that question, is the awareness that there is not enough time. That is true. And the flaw is to think that there's enough time. And in the beginning of law school, it may even feel like there's enough time. But eventually, the more you get into it, you'll start to realize there really isn't enough time for me to study and fully prepare for every single class, to study and fully prepare for every single exam, to go to every single student event that I'm interested in, to go to every social event that I'm interested in, to take advantage of every job opportunity, every clinic, every mentoring opportunity. So you have to then decide, how do you select the things that will benefit you the most at the right times? And that is all strategy. You really have to know how to weigh the pros and cons of making trade-offs. And it's actually an important skill to develop, because it's a skill that you will have to put into practice as a lawyer, right? As a practicing lawyer, it's going to be very common that you simply can't do everything at the same time, but you have clients relying upon you. And so you have to be very intentional. What has to happen now? What has to happen tomorrow? What can happen next week? It means managing your time well. And I talked about scheduling, like block scheduling is critical. And of course, practicing block scheduling in law school is great, because if you work at a law firm or a government organization, or even for a public interest organization, you will have to bill your time to your clients. You will have to keep track of your time at a very minute level. When I worked at the law firm, we had to keep track of our time in 6-minute increments, right? And you had to keep track of what client you were doing work for, when you were doing administrative work, and when you were doing non-billable work. And you had to report that time every week, right? So practicing keeping track of your time during law school it's not a lost skill set to develop. But ultimately, you have to decide at some point that some things will not get done. And that's a hard conversation to have. And it's not one that I can fully have even in this platform. It's one that's best on a one-on-one mentoring capacity, because for some students, and possibly for many students, there will come a time where you're looking at your 4 or 5 classes and you say to yourself, I simply cannot read everything and study effectively for everything. And how do I sit with that and start to make some decisions? What do I read to make sure that I can show up in the classroom and have a conversation, right? And I'm not suggesting you don't read everything, but for some people, they may have to make that decision at some point, that I simply can't read everything. Maybe this week, there's so much going on in my personal life that I can't read everything. Or I can't study for everything right now. So what do I prioritize? Right? What do I put more time into, less time into? I can't go to every single office hour. When do I go? When do I say, you know what? I can't. I know I said go to three times every, you might say I can't do that. So what classes do I go 3, 4 times? What classes do I go once? You have to start to strategize and be constantly self-assessing. Where am I at? Right? How am I using my time? That means every 2 to 3 weeks, you should be taking some time to review. How am I using my time? Am I using it effectively? Are there some classes that I should be putting a little more time into? Are there some that I can take back a little time because I feel really good about it? Right? Are there some professors that I should be visiting more often? Some that I visited once and I feel really great about it. You really got to self-assess on an ongoing basis.
Awesome. Thank you. This next question is about specifically dealing with the abundance of curriculum. So this person says, as the 2L, I feel like I'm drowning with evidence. What advice do you have on handling the abundance of information in addition to the outlining and organization of time that you've mentioned?
It's a very good question. And again, I just want to affirm for you that like feeling like you're drowning in information is not uncommon. Even if it seems like you're the only one drowning and everyone else is getting it. If you're feeling like you're drowning, everyone feels like they're drowning. Right. And that's very common. Trust me. I had many, many classes in law school where I was like, I don't even know what we just talked about today. Like, what did we just talk about? I took notes, but I don't understand what's happening. Right. So, and therefore, I feel like I'm drowning because I'm learning more information and I don't even understand what the previous class was about. And now I'm trying to figure out what we just learned while I'm reading what we're learning. And I just read what we're learning and I don't understand that. So now, like, I'm 3, 4 classes behind in my understanding, even as I'm trying to continue to participate in the conversation. And everything is building up on each other. That can be a very, very difficult place to be in. And so I do want to respect and honor that. What I will say is you have to try to get on top of it early, right? You don't want to feel like I'm drowning, but let me just try to keep up with things and I'll figure it out eventually. That's a dangerous space to be in because you might get to the end of the semester and realize I've never figured it out. And now I have to try to learn everything in 4 days before the exam. That's a recipe for disaster. This is why it's important to start early, take advantage of office hours, and start studying early. And realize that just because you're drowning in the class discussion doesn't mean you have to be drowning in the exam preparation. So if you're drowning in the class discussion, that's a good time to step back and say, you know what? What is the exam going to look like? And if I don't know what the exam is going to look like, I need to figure that out. I need to go to the professor and say, hey, can I look at an old exam? Or what is the exam going to look like? Can I look at a practice exam? The material is very overwhelming. It's a lot. And I'm really trying to begin to understand what should I prioritize? How should I begin to organize the material? Right? If the information is overwhelming, to me, that's a sign that you need to start building your exam outline because you need to start thinking about things at a higher level of abstraction. When I teach contracts, I have like 34 classes, and in almost every class, you're learning something new. And sometimes multiple things. So students are like, this is overwhelming. This is a lot. But once you start preparing for the final exam, and students that come to my office hours, I'll help them with this. I'm like, you could break this down into 6 topics, right? And under those 6 topics, you could fit like 5 topics under each. And once they begin to see the big picture, they're like, oh, I don't have to learn 34 things. I really just have to learn 6 things and understand how these different topics fit under the 6 things and start to see how these 6 things are like 6 different buckets of questions. And so it's an opportunity to step back and say, how do I figure out the big picture? Because this seems like a lot. We just learned 50 things. How do I step back and realize it's really just 5 things and some detail under each? So I think transition to thinking about the exam, go to the professor, say, help me categorize this into some broader topics for me to begin to understand what's happening and see the big picture. And too many students will wait till the end of the semester and think, I'll get the aha moment. And they'll get the aha moment at the second to last class. They're like, oh, I get it, but I never practiced it. And the exam's tomorrow. And I'm kind of screwed. Right? I've had one student in the past come to me like day before the exam. They're like, can you help me learn this? And I'm like, this is, you're asking something that we learn in the second week. And this is going to be a challenge if you don't understand that, because so much builds upon that. Right. So, but yeah, let's jump into another question.
Absolutely. So there are a couple of questions about encountering bias, both in your personal experience and just in preparation for this person asked specifically about being a minority student. So whether it's been explicit bias or implicit bias, and on a professional or personal level, how have you dealt with that, or how can students maybe prepare for encountering that as they move into the legal space?
It's very hard to navigate. And if you're someone from a marginalized background, either because of where you're from or your age or your gender or sex, or if you're someone from a minoritized background, or your class status, it's very difficult to avoid bias. It's difficult to avoid because it's actually in the law itself, right? It sometimes emerges in the legal opinions itself. I still have, I actually wrote a law review article called The Miseducation of Public Citizens. It's in the Georgetown Journal Legal Ethics, I believe. And in that article, I talk about what public citizenship means. It's in the preamble to the model rules of professional ethics for lawyers, right? Lawyers are called to be public citizens with a special responsibility for justice. And you'll learn all about that when you take your, class on professional responsibility. But what I write about in that article is an experience I had in my first year of my criminal law class. I grew up in the South Bronx, as I said, in the 80s and 90s. And I took the train from the Bronx to Manhattan to go to school every day. And in our criminal justice and criminal law class, we learned about a legal case called the People versus Bernard Goetz. And that is a case where, and it's interesting because that same case came up in recent years when the Black Lives Matter movement was, surging, because the Kyle Rittenhouse case was put in parallel with that one. It's a case about self-defense. And the short story is there were some teenagers who were on the train goofing off. They went to this gentleman, asked him for $5 in a posture that he felt they were trying to rob him. He pulled out a gun and fired off a round of bullets. I think they were rubber bullets, but it still inflicted significant damage. And I won't, go graphic or anything for the purposes of the webinar, but it was very triggering, very difficult to read because it was a case about New York City where I grew up, and I used to take the train all the time. And I knew what it was like to be a young kid fooling around and to have someone believe that you're a criminal. And this was happening during the 80s when that bias was very real. What made it even more challenging is the conversation in the classroom wasn't designed to provide a safe space for students that had gone through a similar lived experience as I had, where they had seen some of these things firsthand. So the professor didn't do the best job in navigating some of those unconscious biases coming out in student comments. One student I recall said, well, it makes sense that he was afraid of these people on the train, and so self-defense should be justified. Right? You can hear some of the implicit biases coming out, and that can be very damaging for the student. I was silenced during that moment. I really didn't speak up very much during that part of the conversation in class. And it was a very almost traumatizing experience for me as I describe it in the paper. And so that's something that as a student of color or a marginalized student is very difficult to avoid, right? There are some cases where you'll read in law school about gender identity issues, about class, about poverty. That could be very triggering. What I will say is that law faculty are trying to do and are doing a better and better job at creating safe spaces for students to have really intelligent and emotionally mature conversations about those topics. So we are getting better at that. That said, part of protecting yourself and making sure that you're mentally stable and healthy as you're navigating that is building that social network and having those outside practices, whether it's a spiritual practice or a health practice or wellness practice, that can help you navigate those tensions, right? Because you will also encounter students that have their own biases based on where they grew up and where they came from. And how do you navigate stepping into the classroom where someone makes a comment that you experience as racist or biased? You have to have other social networks, other spaces outside that can provide you with the support that you need, whether it's a church, a group of friends, an affinity group, where you can connect with other people who have similar shared experiences and they can pour back into you and reaffirm you and let you know that experience doesn't define you and it's not going to shape your future career. And so, I appreciate the question, and unfortunately, I can't promise that you won't experience that. All I can offer is to try to get ahead of it by providing that space for balance, that outlet that you will be able to turn to during those moments. Because when I experienced that class, all I could do was leave the class and say, let me find my friends. Let me find that group so I can connect, so I could talk about it, so I could let it out and be reaffirmed to know you can still make it. You still belong here. You can be successful. Those viewpoints don't define who you are, and they don't define what the law is and what it means to be a good lawyer. And you can rise above that.
Thank you so much for sharing your personal experience and that insight and answering all of our audience questions. Those are all the questions we have for today. And thank you all so much for submitting your questions. We want to thank you so much for being a part of another Justia webinar. For law students, as I mentioned at the top of today's presentation, in addition to our law student focused webinars like this presentation, you can also visit justia.jobs to connect with potential career opportunities, AI tools that can help you develop your career materials further, and more. So please feel free to log on there and find the right career opportunity and tools for you. Thank you all so much for your time and attention, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks for watching. We hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did enjoy it, please click the like button and subscribe to our channel for more videos on law practice and legal marketing. See you in our next video.